He fired the black nanny on Christmas Eve, right after she made his silent son smile for the first time in a year. Hours later, that same boy screamed her name into the night, his very first word since his mother died. Snow fell gently over Manhattan, blanketing the Whitmore mansion in a soft, glittering silence. Outside, Christmas lights shimmered along every balcony, and distant carols floated through the frozen air. It looked like a perfect holiday scene, warm, wealthy, untouched by pain. Inside, it was anything but. Daniel Whitmore stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, a glass of untouched whiskey in his hand, his reflection staring back colder than the winter outside. At 42, he had everything: power, money, control, everything except the one thing that had shattered 3 years ago on a snowy Christmas night. Behind him, the house echoed with a different kind of silence. Lucas, 7 years old, bright, once. Now, wordless. For an entire year, his son hadn't spoken a single word. Doctors called it trauma. Specialists called it a phase. Daniel called it a problem he couldn't fix. Until she arrived. Amara Johnson didn't look like a miracle. Just a quiet black nanny with warm eyes and a voice too soft for a house this cold. But the moment she began humming beside Lucas that evening, something shifted. The boy moved. Just slightly. Just enough. Daniel turned sharply, his breath catching because for the first time in months, his son wasn't staring into emptiness. He was looking at her, and for a fleeting, impossible second, Lucas smiled, but Daniel didn't know yet that this moment would cost him everything. The smile didn't last long. By the time the Christmas lights outside flickered brighter against the darkening sky, Daniel had already turned away, convincing himself it meant nothing. A reflex, a coincidence, something explainable, because miracles didn't exist in his world. 3 years earlier, on a night just like this, snow falling, streets glowing, Daniel Whitmore had lost everything that ever made him human. Clara, his wife. She had insisted on driving home after a small Christmas gathering, laughing softly as she rested a hand over her swollen belly. "It's our last Christmas as just two," she had said, smiling at him through the dim car light. Daniel remembered that moment with brutal clarity. The warmth in her eyes. The quiet promise of the future. And then, headlights. A flash of white. The scream of twisting metal. By the time Daniel reached the hospital, the world had already split into 2 versions. One where Clara still existed, and one where she didn't. Lucas survived. Clara didn't. The doctors called it a miracle. A child pulled from tragedy. Alive against impossible odds. Daniel never saw it that way. To him, that night marked the beginning of silence. At first, Lucas cried constantly, as if he had inherited all the grief Daniel refused to show. But after a few months, even that stopped. The crying turned into quiet. The quiet turned into absence. And then one day, Lucas simply stopped speaking. No words, no laughter, no sound. Just those wide, distant eyes that seemed to look past everything and everyone. Daniel did what he always did when faced with a problem. He tried to fix it. The best pediatric neurologists in New York. Child psychologists flown in from Boston. Private therapists with years of experience in trauma recovery. Each one came with confident diagnoses, structured plans, and promises wrapped in clinical language. Selective mutism. Post-traumatic emotional shutdown. He just needs time. Time. That word became a slow poison. Because no matter how much of it passed, nothing changed. Lucas didn't respond to questions. Didn't react to toys. Didn't even flinch when Daniel raised his voice in frustration. Something that haunted him later more than he would ever admit. Eventually, the house adapted to the silence. Staff learned to move quietly. Conversations became whispers. Even the grand piano in the living room, once Clara's favorite, remained untouched, its lid closed like a sealed memory no one dared open. And Daniel? He buried himself deeper into work. If he couldn't fix his son, he would at least control everything else. His company expanded, his wealth multiplied. His name carried weight in rooms where emotions were considered weakness. But every night, when the meetings ended and the screens went dark, He returned to a house that felt colder than any winter outside, and a son who no longer reached for him. Amara Johnson entered that silence quietly. No dramatic introduction, no grand moment, just a recommendation from a local agency, a replacement after yet another nanny had quit, unable to handle a child who never spoke, and a father who barely looked at her. Amara didn't arrive with promises. She didn't ask Lucas questions he couldn't answer. She didn't try to force him into conversation. Instead, she listened. To the silence. To the small things others ignored. The way Lucas's fingers twitched when certain melodies played faintly in the background. The way his breathing shifted when the wind carried distant carolers past the gates. The way his eyes lingered not on people but on sound. That was when she understood. "This boy isn't empty," she whispered to herself one evening, watching him sit by the window. "He's hiding." The next night, she tried something different. No therapy tools, no structured methods, just her voice. Soft, low, steady. A Christmas hymn she used to sing in a small church years ago, before life had taken everything from her, too. At first, nothing happened. Lucas didn't move, didn't react, didn't even blink. But Amara kept singing, because she knew what silence felt like, and she knew sometimes the only way out of it was to be gently called back. Then, something shifted. So small, it could have been missed. Lucas's fingers curled slightly against the armrest, his head tilted, and slowly, almost uncertainly, he turned toward her. Amara's voice faltered for half a second, but she kept going. Softer now, like she was afraid the moment might break. Lucas stared at her, not through her, at her, as if something deep inside him was trying to remember. And then, his lips parted, barely. No sound came out, but it was enough. Enough to change everything. The change didn't happen all at once. It came in fragments, quiet, fragile moments that could have easily been dismissed if no one had been paying close enough attention. But Amara was. Every evening, as the sky darkened and the city lights flickered on beyond the tall windows, she would sit a few feet away from Lucas and sing. Never too loud, never forcing his attention, just enough for the sound to exist, like a gentle invitation. At first, Lucas only listened. His body remained still, his expression distant, but his eyes no longer wandered aimlessly. They stayed, anchored, on hair. 3 nights later, something shifted again. Amara had just begun humming a soft Christmas lullaby when she noticed Lucas's fingers tapping faintly against the armrest. Not randomly, but in rhythm. Imperfect, uneven, but unmistakably following the melody. She didn't react, didn't smile, didn't speak, because she understood something most people didn't. The moment you try to capture a fragile miracle, you risk breaking it. So she kept singing, and Lucas kept listening. By the end of that week, the distance between them had changed. He no longer sat across the room. Now he sat beside her, not touching, not speaking, but close enough that their silence felt shared instead of empty. One evening, as snow fell heavier than usual, Amara placed a small, unfinished Christmas ornament on the table between them, just a plain wooden star, a box of paint beside it. She didn't tell him what to do. She simply began painting her own, slow strokes, calm movements. Minutes passed. Then, a soft scrape. Lucas reached for the brush. His small hand hesitated mid-air, as if asking permission from a world that had long stopped answering him. Amara didn't look at him, but she gently nudged the paint closer. That was all it took. Lucas dipped the brush, carefully, clumsily, and pressed color onto the wood. It wasn't perfect. The lines were uneven, the paint too thick in places, but it was the first time he had engaged with anything in months. And for Amara, it was everything. Later that night, when Daniel returned from work, he stopped at the doorway. He didn't enter, didn't speak. He just stood there, watching. Lucas sat at the table, the small painted star in front of him. Amara beside him, quietly cleaning the brushes. No pressure, no expectation, just peace. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly. He didn't understand what he was seeing. Not fully, but he couldn't deny it. Something was changing. The next night, something even more impossible happened. Amara was sitting on the floor this time, her back resting lightly against the couch as she sang a softer, slower hymn. Lucas sat beside her, closer than ever before. As her voice filled the room, he turned toward her again. But this time, he didn't just look, he moved. Slowly, carefully, like every motion required courage. He reached out. His small hand lifted, hovered, then gently pressed against her throat. Amara's breath caught. She didn't stop singing, because she understood instantly. He wasn't touching her. He was feeling the sound, the vibration, the life in her voice. Lucas's eyes widened slightly, as if something inside him had finally found a path back to the surface. His fingers trembled faintly against her skin, following each note, each rise and fall. And then, his lips parted again, more than before. His chest rose sharply, like he was trying to push something through a barrier that had held him captive for far too long. A sound almost formed. Almost, but not yet. Amara's voice softened even further, barely above a whisper now, guiding rather than leading. "It's okay," she murmured between notes. "You're safe." Lucas's breathing hitched. His hand tightened slightly, and then, a faint, broken whisper slipped through, so quiet it barely existed, so fragile it could disappear if acknowledged too quickly. Amara heard it, but she didn't react, because she knew this wasn't the moment to celebrate. This was the moment to protect. Across the room, Daniel stepped forward unconsciously, his heart pounding. "Lucas?" he whispered, but Lucas froze instantly. The moment shattered. The fragile thread snapped. His hand dropped. His expression closed. And just like that, the silence returned. Only this time, it wasn't empty anymore. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything before. Not empty, not distant, but fragile, like something that had just begun to heal and was suddenly forced shut again. Daniel stood frozen in the middle of the room, his voice still lingering in the air where it didn't belong. Lucas had already turned away. His body curled slightly inward, retreating into the same invisible place he had lived in for the past year. His hands rested lifelessly in his lap again. His eyes, once flickering with something almost alive, dimmed back into that unreachable stillness. Daniel's chest tightened. "What just happened?" he asked, his voice lower now, controlled but strained. Amara didn't answer immediately. She remained seated, her gaze still on Lucas, as if speaking too soon might make things worse. Finally, she said quietly, "You interrupted him." Daniel frowned. "I said his name." "Yes," Amara replied softly. "But for him, that was too much." Daniel's jaw clenched. "Too much?" He took a step forward, frustration creeping in beneath his calm exterior. "He's my son. I'm allowed to speak to him." Amara nodded gently. "Of course you are." Her tone didn't challenge him, but something about it unsettled him more than if she had. "Then explain to me," Daniel pressed. "Why the moment I try to reach him, he shuts down completely." Amara hesitated. Not because she didn't know the answer, but because she knew he wouldn't like it. "He's not ready for you yet," she said. The words landed harder than either of them expected. Daniel's expression darkened instantly. "Not ready for me?" he repeated, disbelief sharp in his voice. "I'm his father." "I know," Amara said, still calm. "But right now, you remind him of something he's trying to survive." Silence. Cold. Sharp. Daniel let out a short, humorless breath. "And you don't?" Amara didn't respond right away, because the truth was, she didn't. Not in the same way. "I don't ask anything from him," she said finally. "I don't expect him to speak. I don't try to fix him. I just meet him where he is." Daniel's eyes hardened. "That's not parenting," he said flatly. "That's avoidance." "No," Amara replied quietly. "That's trust." The tension between them snapped into place. For a moment, neither of them moved. Behind them, the soft glow of Christmas lights reflected off the windows, warm, festive, almost mocking the cold distance inside the room. Daniel turned away first. "I didn't hire you to replace me," he said, his voice colder now. I hired you to help my son recover. Amara stood slowly. And that's exactly what I'm doing. Daniel looked back at her. Something sharper in his gaze, now something closer to suspicion. Or maybe, he said slowly, you're getting too comfortable here. The words hung in the air, heavy, unspoken meaning pressing underneath them. Amara's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes did. Not hurt, not anger, just understanding. I see, she said quietly. At that moment, a new voice cut through the tension. Well, I was wondering how long it would take. Evelyn Whitmore stepped into the room, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor. Elegant, composed, watching everything. Her gaze moved from Daniel, to Amara, to Lucas, and then back again. I've seen this before, she continued smoothly. Help becomes attachment. Attachment becomes ambition. Daniel didn't respond, but he didn't interrupt either. Amara noticed that. Evelyn took a few steps closer, her voice lowering just enough to sound almost kind. You've done your job. The boy is slightly improved. That's more than anyone else managed. A pause. Then, but let's not blur lines that shouldn't be crossed. The message was clear, painfully clear. Across the room, Lucas shifted slightly. His fingers curled again just for a second, like something inside him was reacting, but didn't know how to stay. Amara noticed. Daniel didn't. And that was the difference. Amara looked at Lucas one last time, then back at Daniel. I was never trying to replace anyone, she said softly. But he needs consistency. If you take that away now, we'll manage, Daniel cut in. Too quickly, too firmly, as if the decision had already been made. Silence fell again. But this time, it wasn't fragile anymore. It was breaking. Amara nodded once. No argument. No pleading. Just acceptance. All right, she said. And somehow, that was worse. Because, for the first time since she arrived, the warmth she brought into the house began to disappear. And Lucas felt it, even if he couldn't say it. The house changed the moment Amara left. Not in a way anyone could see at first. The lights were still on. The decorations still hung perfectly. The Christmas tree still stood tall in the center of the living room, wrapped in gold and silver like nothing had ever been broken inside these walls. But the warmth was gone, and Lucas felt it immediately. That night, he didn't sit by the window. He didn't touch the painted star. He didn't move at all. Daniel watched from a distance, arms crossed, convincing himself this was temporary. Children adapted. That's what the doctors had always said. He'll be fine, he muttered under his breath. But Lucas wasn't fine. The first night passed in silence. The second night, it broke. A sharp crash echoed through the house. Daniel rushed into the living room to find shattered glass scattered across the floor. The Christmas ornament Lucas had painted lay in pieces, streaks of color smeared across the polished wood like something violently torn apart. Lucas stood in the middle of it, shaking, his chest rising too fast, his hands clenched into fists. Lucas! Daniel stepped forward, startled. What are you doing? No response. But this time, it wasn't emptiness. It was something else. Something raw. Something breaking loose. Lucas grabbed another ornament and threw it. Hard. It shattered against the wall. Daniel's voice sharpened. Stop it. Lucas flinched, but he didn't stop. His breathing became uneven, desperate. His small body trembling like it couldn't contain what was building inside him. Daniel reached for him. Lucas, calm down. The moment his hand touched him, Lucas screamed. It wasn't a cry. It wasn't a sound of fear. It was a sound that had been trapped for a year, ripping its way out all at once. Daniel froze, because for the first time, his son made a sound. But it wasn't the one he had hoped for. It was pain. Raw, unfiltered, terrifying. Lucas? Daniel whispered, his voice shaking now. Lucas stumbled backward, shaking his head violently, as if trying to escape something only he could see. Then, a sound broke through. Broken, uneven, barely formed. Ma. Daniel's breath caught. Everything inside him stopped. Ma. Lucas's lips trembled, trying again, his voice fragile but real. Ma. Daniel's heart pounded violently. "Lucas," he said quickly, stepping closer, desperate now. "Say it again. Say it again." But Lucas wasn't looking at him. I was looking past him, toward the empty space where someone used to sit, toward the silence that had just been taken away from him. And then, the sound was clearer, more certain. Not Mama, not Clara, not his father. Amara. Daniel stepped back as if something had struck him. The realization came slowly. Then, all at once. This wasn't random. This wasn't coincidence. Lucas hadn't been silent because he couldn't speak. He had been waiting. Waiting for the one person who made him feel safe enough to try. And Daniel had taken her away. The room felt suffocating. Daniel ran a hand through his hair, his breathing uneven now. "No," he muttered. "No, that's not." But the truth was already there. Unavoidable. And it didn't stop there. The next morning, things got worse. Lucas refused to eat. Refused to move. His eyes hollow again, but this time, there was something else underneath. Grief. Daniel called in a specialist. Then another. Then another. Each one left with the same conclusion. He's regressing. He experienced emotional progress, and then sudden loss. This kind of disruption can be damaging. One doctor looked at Daniel carefully before saying, "Did something change recently?" Daniel didn't answer, because he already knew. By the third day, Lucas was barely responsive. He lay in bed, staring at nothing, his small body weaker, quieter but not peaceful. Not anymore. Daniel sat beside him that night, exhaustion finally breaking through his control. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like a man who had everything. He felt helpless. Again. Just like that night. His gaze shifted slowly to the corner of the room. The piano, Clara's piano, untouched for years. Without thinking, Daniel stood, walked toward it, and opened it. The sound of the lid lifting echoed softly in the room. Lucas's fingers twitched. Daniel froze her. Then, hesitantly, he pressed a key. A single note. Flat. Uncertain. But it filled the silence. Lucas's breathing changed. Just slightly. Daniel swallowed hard. And pressed another. Then another. The melody was broken. Incomplete. But familiar. It was the song Clara used to play every Christmas. Daniel's hands trembled as he continued, each note pulling something long buried back to the surface. Behind him, Lucas moved. Slowly. Weakly. His lips parted again. And this time, the sound came clearer. Stronger. Daniel's eyes shut tightly. Guilt crashed over him like a wave. He had been wrong. Completely. And now, his son was paying the price. Daniel stood abruptly, grabbing his coat, his voice tight with urgency. "Find her," he ordered the staff. "I don't care where she is. I want every contact, every agency, every address checked. But sir, it's Christmas Eve. I don't care." His voice echoed through the house, sharp and desperate. Then softer. "I need to fix this." Hours later, snow began to fall heavier over the city. And for the first time in years, Daniel Whitmore stepped out into it. Not as a man in control, but as a father who was running out of time. The city was almost unrecognizable under the weight of Christmas night. Snow fell thick and steady, swallowing the noise of Manhattan, turning even the busiest streets into something softer, quieter, almost forgiving. But Daniel Whitmore felt none of it. He drove through the storm with trembling hands, his vision blurred, not just by the snow, but by something far heavier pressing inside his chest. Regret. Every streetlight he passed felt like a reminder. Every second. A delay he could no longer afford. "Please," he whispered under his breath, gripping the steering wheel tighter. "Just let me find her in time." The address had come from the agency, one last file, nearly overlooked. A note about temporary housing, a church connection. It wasn't much, but it was all he had. When he finally arrived, the car barely came to a full stop before he stepped out into the snow. The cold hit him instantly, but he didn't feel it. Not really, because just ahead, through the soft glow of stained glass windows, he heard it. A voice. Familiar. Gentle. Singing. Daniel froze. His heart slammed against his ribs as he moved slowly toward the small church doors, pushing them open just enough to step inside. Warmth wrapped around him instantly, not just from the heat, but from something deeper. Candles flickered softly along the walls. A modest Christmas tree stood near the altar, decorated with simple handmade ornaments. A few scattered people sat quietly in the pews, heads bowed, and at the front, Amara. She stood beneath the dim golden light, eyes closed, hands loosely clasped as she sang. Her voice filled the space, not powerful, not overwhelming, but steady, healing, like it carried something broken and refused to let it fall apart. Daniel couldn't move. For a moment, he simply stood there, listening, understanding. Finally, this wasn't just music. This was what Lucas had felt. This was what he had lost. The song ended softly, the last note fading into silence. Amara opened her eyes and saw him. For a brief second, something flickered across her face, surprise, hesitation, something guarded. Daniel stepped forward slowly. "I'm sorry," he said. No defense, no explanation, just the truth, stripped bare. Amara didn't respond immediately. She studied him, not the man he used to be, but the one standing in front of her now. Tired, uncertain, human. "You shouldn't be here," she said quietly. "I know," Daniel admitted. "But I didn't come for me." A pause. Then, "It's Lucas." That was all it took. Amara's expression changed instantly. "What happened?" she asked, her voice no longer guarded, only concerned. Daniel swallowed hard. "He's getting worse. He won't eat. He barely moves. And..." His voice broke slightly. "He's trying to speak." Amara's breath caught. "He said your name." Silence fell between them. Heavy. Real. Amara looked down for a moment, her fingers tightening slightly at her sides. "I told you," she said softly. "He needed consistency." "I know," Daniel replied quickly. "And I took that away from him. I was wrong." Amara looked back up. "And now?" she asked. Daniel hesitated, because this part mattered. "Now I'm asking you to come back," he said. "Not as an employee, not as someone I control, but as someone he trusts, someone he needs." Amara's eyes searched his. "And what about you?" she asked quietly. "Do you trust me?" The question landed deeper than anything else that night. Daniel didn't answer immediately, because for the first time, in a long time, he chose not to rush. "I'm learning to," he said. "Honest, imperfect, but real." Amara exhaled slowly. Her gaze drifted briefly toward the small Christmas tree beside the altar, simple, imperfect, yet full of meaning. Then back to him. "I'm not coming back for you," she said. "I know," Daniel replied. "I'm coming back for him." A small nod. That was enough. The drive back felt different, quieter, but not empty. When they entered the mansion, the air inside felt heavier than before, like the house itself was holding its breath. Daniel led her upstairs, each step slower than the last, until they reached Lucas's room. The door opened, and there he was, small, still, fragile against the white sheets. Amara stepped forward immediately, her presence shifting the entire room before she even spoke. "Lucas," she whispered. His fingers twitched. Then again, his eyes opened slowly. And the moment he saw her, everything changed. Recognition flooded his face, fragile but undeniable. His breathing quickened. His lips trembled. Amara moved closer, kneeling beside the bed, her voice softer now. "I'm here," she whispered. "I didn't leave you." Lucas's hand lifted weakly, reaching. She took it gently, and that was when it happened. His chest rose sharply, his voice fragile, broken, but real, pushed through the silence that had held him for so long. "Mom." The word hung in the air. Soft, sacred, unbelievable. Daniel froze behind them, his entire world shifting in that single moment. Amara's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't correct him, didn't pull away, because this wasn't about replacing someone. This was about healing something that had been broken too long. "I'm here," she whispered again. Lucas's grip tightened slightly around her hand. And for the first time since that night 3 years ago, the silence in that house didn't feel like loss anymore. It felt like something new, something fragile, but alive. Weeks later, the mansion looked the same, but it wasn't. Laughter, quiet, rare, but real, began to return. Lucas spoke more. Slowly, carefully. But each word carried weight. Daniel changed too. Less control, more presence, more listening. And Amara, she stayed. Not as a replacement, not as a solution, but as someone who chose to remain. Because sometimes, family isn't the one you lose. It's the one that finds you again. And on that Christmas, the miracle wasn't just that a boy spoke again. It was that 3 broken hearts learned how to belong.